Welcome to the RFP Success Show with host Lisa Rehurik, the #1 sought-after authority on RFP success. Each week, we bring you information, strategies, or resources to help you win more business through RFPs and have a little fun doing it. Let's get this week's episode started.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the RFP Success Show. I am Lisa Rehurik, your host, and I am also founder and CEO of the RFP Success Company. Today, we're talking a whole bunch of fun things. We're going to be talking strategy, competition, and industry trends with an industry veteran, Ajay Patel. And we're actually going to split this into 2 different episodes. It's a little bit of a series because there's so much for us to talk about. That's 3 really big topics. And I want to make sure that we get as much as we can. Ajay is fantastic, so we're going to get a lot of great stuff from him. So a little bit about Ajay. He's president and CEO of SMA, which is an industry leader in providing on-demand solutions and professional services. Now he's going to tell you more about what that means. Welcome, Ajay.
Thank you, Lisa. Should I just get a little background about myself to get started?
Yeah, why don't we do that? Tell us a little bit about yourself, the background, how long you've been working with RFPs, and kind of what you currently do.
All right, excellent. So, why don't we start with how I started my career? So I'm actually a physicist by education, and I have an MBA. So that certainly doesn't say immediately, hey, AJ, he knows proposals. Like many of us, this career became an accident, right? And I think this is just kind of one of the common things that unifies almost everyone in this business. I started my career in the very early 1980s in aerospace and defense as an engineer at TRW. And at some point, I was asked to help on some proposal, right? And that, I think, kind of happens to almost all of us.
Right.
And right. And indeed, after perhaps if your first one's successful, you get asked to do the next one. And so that happened to me quite a bit in the 1980s. I ultimately actually became fairly well known at TRW around pricing strategy and leading cost volumes. And then, almost for many of us, you quickly kind of get into a particular niche around this part of our business. It wasn't really until 1992 when I realized that this was actually a profession. I had just kind of through some networking, I had an opportunity to meet an individual by the name of Steve Myers, who was the original founder of SMA. So today, SMA, as a number of other firms as well, is one of the consulting companies that other companies who are looking for help on their competitive efforts, whether it's helping them on the capture and BD side or on the proposal side, would come to hire for support. So essentially individuals to come in and help them throughout that process. I think perhaps, one of the things that really makes not just, my experience in this business, but almost everyone's experience in this business quite unique from other professions is that we didn't go to school for this. Right. It almost became this accidental thing for us. And I think it's partly because of what we do is very integrative. First of all, you kind of have to like the subject you're writing about. You have to have an interest in business, right?
Yeah.
And you really have to enjoy communicating, creating compelling content for others to read. And if you kind of also have to absolutely love competing. And also, I think what's made this profession really rewarding is you almost get to immediately always see the impact of your contribution. You either win or you lose for most competitions, right?
Yeah, that's so true. And it is true that, we don't, and I don't even know if that is the case now. Does anybody go to school and say, I want to be a proposal writer? I don't even think that exists. Maybe I'm wrong. I'm kind of an old soul, so.
Yeah, well, as I am too. I think I had an opportunity to participate 2 summers ago around an effort by APMP to try to create some internship programs, and our firm participated in that. And I think there's one school, and I'm sorry for your listeners, I can't recall which school in particular. It's in the East Coast that actually I think is attempting to create some sort of a program, a syllabus around our profession. So hats off to them. I hope they can succeed with doing that.
Yeah, I hope so too. That's really interesting because it is, it's a pretty big business. So you'd think that there would be a career for it out there by now. Let's talk. We're going to kick it off really by talking about strategy. So, in these 2 episodes, we're going to talk about strategy and competition and industry trends. But I want to start off by talking about strategy and really the $1 million question, like, what do we mean when we talk about strategy in the context of RFP responses?
Okay. So that is indeed the $1 million question. It's one of those things where you kind of know it when you see it, right? And it's really hard to define. First, I think before I kind of try to answer your question directly, I do want to make a suggestion to your listeners. There's been a handful of books that have certainly helped shape my thinking around this. So Mintzberg, a well-known management theorist, academician, he wrote a book called The Strategy Safari. It's an excellent and it's an easy read. I highly recommend that. It's about different schools of strategy. As an individual, it's almost a tome. It's by Lawrence Friedman. It's actually just called The History of Strategy. That's a bit of a hard read, but it's worthwhile to get through it. And I think there's three other authors too. Rummelt, he was a professor at UCLA, who has written most recently. He's a well-known academician in strategy and management theory. He recently just wrote a book called Good Strategy, Bad Strategy. It's a great read, actually. And then there's a couple of classics, Michael Porter on competitive strategy, and also even going farther back in time, an individual by the name of Albert Chandler is a well-known historian mostly around business strategy. But, for your listeners, if you're really interested in this topic, those authors and the books and articles that they've written, I think can be very helpful in terms of how to think, first of all, more broadly about it, as well as trying to get an appropriate context for what we do as a profession. Let me see if I can kind of give you a short answer to this $1 million question. Yeah. I think we need to really kind of reduce it to when you have it, what do you do with it for it to really be meaningful for us. Okay. So the way I certainly think about strategy is that it's about the choices that you make, that creates a differentiation in the market. It's the choices that really makes your offer different than your competitor's offer. And it's really not how you think about it, but how your customers see your offers. So it's really about the choices you make that makes you different at the end of the day.
So I love that because it makes it really simplistic. And, it's interesting as we, work with proposals and all have conversations with people, probably more people in the small business arena when, they're just starting to get introduced to RFPs, but they're like, what do you mean strategy? I just need to respond to this RFP and answer these questions. But, to your point, and I preach this all the time too, strategy is so important to make sure that the differentiators really come out. Yeah, it's one thing to just answer the questions, but everybody else is going to be just answering the questions. So what are you going to do to help yourself stand out? And that's where that strategy piece fits in.
Yeah, and I think there's some interesting nuance there. So it's kind of making in your thinking process, thought process, making the transition from thinking about what makes you different as your attributes to actually what you're doing very specifically for that customer's direct need in terms of what they're buying at that time. So a lot of firms have very similar attributes, which really don't differentiate your offering. Right. It's about what you do with those attributes that creates a differentiation in what it is that you're selling for that specific need.
Yeah, and they can't be the same across all the different bids. Would you agree with that statement?
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely.
Because I do hear that a lot too. People are like, well, we've got a strategy. Here's our strategy for all of our bids. And I'm like, no, that doesn't really work, right? You've got to have each bid is different. So I like that. One of the things, AJ, that we talked about on our last phone call that I was really fascinated by is that there are really different approaches to strategy. And you hit on that with Strategy Safari book, which I am immediately going to get. I can't wait to read that. Can you talk to us a little bit about the different approaches to strategy?
So we think there's really kind of, if you think about and I think we've all have experienced parts of the strategy formulation process in the proposals that we've all supported. And if you kind of think back across that, we've kind of reduced it to three ways that it's typically done. And we think there's a fourth, but the three ways, the first one is Socratic, where the process or the formulation process is reduced to essentially predefined questions. I have a little commentary on kind of each of these as I go through it, but I like to kind of let your listeners know what the three schools are first. Okay. There's a gaming approach to strategy. This isn't used often. It's really about role playing. And if you think about what some of your listeners are aware of, what we might call black hats, yes, that's really kind of the tip of the iceberg around the gaming approach to strategy formulation. And then the last one, last traditional approach is what I call Delphic. So it's the viewpoint of a key person on your team And usually that person is, the person that your company always kind of goes to and say, hey, this, Joe, he really understands his customer, or Joe, he won the last 10 bids, right? He thinks, strategically. Let's go ask him what our strategy ought to be. It's like going to the Oracle of Delphi. And so I think those are kind of, as we've seen it practiced over the last 30 years, almost everyone's way of thinking about strategy, I think, kind of falls into one of these three broad categories. And there's limitations. There's certainly positive aspects of each of these. It's the limitations that caused us as a firm to kind of rethink this. When the Socratic approach, where it's reduced to a set of predefined questions, well, you've got to get the questions right, to have a good strategy outcome. And that's a big if. The gaming approach actually is a pretty heavy involvement of effort, but I think its biggest limitation is lacks rigor, because there's really no clear burden of proof. And you might actually leave some important aspects out in that gaming approach.
For the listeners that don't know anything about Black Hat, can you do a quick little explanation of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So kind of reduced to as simple as what a Black Hat step in a proposal development process usually entails is that you would form basically teams where you would assign maybe 3 or 4 folks to each team, and each team represents a competitor. And you would ask that team to essentially, it's usually a 1 day, 1.5 day effort to actually produce what that company's strategy will be to win a particular bid. And so that team would basically think through what their discriminators are, will think through what their win themes are, what actions they'll take, right? What their pricing strategy might be. And then at the end of that process, where each team does this independently, you come together as a group, and each team basically bids essentially their win strategy to each other, right? And that gives the proposal development team essentially an opportunity to kind of get the benefit of what each competitor might actually do in that bid.
Yeah.
And so to make Black Hat process actually, where the results of that are actually something which the proposal development team can use, you typically have to do some work in advance, competitive assessment work, some competitive intelligence work, maybe some price to win work. But there's usually a considerable amount of advanced work that needs to be done prior to actually conducting a Black Hat.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for that. I know there's probably some listeners out there that definitely aren't familiar, so appreciate that rundown.
And it's just one of what's become a multitude of color team reviews, right, in our industry.
Yep. And I actually just did a podcast on color team reviews not too long ago. So for those of you curious about that, you can go back and listen to that one. But
Great. So, there's lots of colors. I don't get surprised when I find a new color being used.
Right.
So getting back to the schools, so these 3 schools, so there's certainly some positives, but there's also some considerable limitations. I think in our experience, they rarely result in truly a game-changing strategy. And some competitions are won on a truly game-changing strategy. I think perhaps even a real common limitation is that while choices may appear to get made, they kind of fall apart during the process because they don't have consensus. And consensus is really created because you need commitment throughout the organization for many strategies to really work, right? Whether it's your finance team or your engineering team or across the organization, right? And the reason why consensus usually isn't created in these approaches is because they don't really offer an opportunity to reveal assumptions and biases. And that's really the only way. You need a transparent approach to really kind of uncover assumptions and biases that people have. So you can't take opinion as fact. You really kind of have to dig down and say, well, what are you assuming when you form that opinion? And so our experience has been that while you might go through one of these 3 schools and a set of choices do get made, oftentimes they tend to fall apart during the process of actually putting the proposal together. And sometimes because it's like a black box, these 3 schools are largely kind of a black box in many ways. There could be a fault in logic around the win logic. It might not be supported by data. And it also is static. What if the conditions change? What if somebody decides to no bid it in the competitive landscape? Or what if the customer changes the requirement of something? So those are some significant limitations around those 3 schools of strategy. So we have an approach which we think is analytic, but it's really built around kind of making that black box much more transparent.
And is it using kind of a combination of these, or this is like a completely different approach, really? When you
it's a completely different approach. It's actually derived from approaches that are used when companies formulate in a very robust way their corporate or business unit strategy. It's really designed to make this black box a strategy. And when I say black box, and I don't know if hopefully your listeners can relate, oftentimes the folks doing the strategy, it's almost they have an input, there's an output, and you don't really know what goes on inside their thinking process.
Right.
And so it's really designed around creating transparency. It's about exposing the assumptions. It's about considering multiple sets of choices, not just one set, where each set actually ends up becoming a distinctive strategy. So you can compare the various approaches to strategy. It's about being inclusive. So by being exclusive, it actually means considering, different points of view, different perspectives on this. It's also about, it's got to be testable. If your strategy and your choices aren't testable, how do you know you have a good strategy?
Great point.
And so I think the simplest way I can describe the approach that we've developed at SMA is really, it revolves around a basic fundamental question, which is if you just continue to ask yourself this question, you'll ultimately kind of get to a robust strategy. And the question is, what has to be true for this choice to be a good choice?
Wow,
if you keep on asking that question, you'll really get a lot of insight. You'll expose the systemic biases that exist, amongst all of us.
Yep.
You'll certainly expose the assumptions, and you'll start to understand, well, if something that has to be true for the choice to be a good one, then you can ask yourself, well, if that condition, if it's not true today, can we make it true? Right? During the course of the proposal effort.
Yeah.
And so now all of a sudden you're taking it from thinking about it as an inclusive set of choices that you're testing, and you set a burden of proof now, right? So now you actually have a burden of proof around your strategy to know whether or not it's a good one or a bad one.
I love that.
Through this process, by making it transparent and inclusive, you really get both cognitive and emotional commitment to the course of action, which at the end of the day actually drives, I think, a lot of wins more so than we all like to admit.
Right. And who do you involve in this process and in the discussion around strategy? Because, there's so many people on the proposal team and, when you talked about the commitment, we've got to get commitment from people, but how do you involve everybody, or who are the key players that you involve in the whole strategy piece?
Yeah, and I think that depends on the industry that you're involved in, right? And so, but if you think about kind of an engineering-based industry, an industrial company,
yep.
You would certainly need to include the key individuals from the engineering department. You would need to certainly, if you think about kind of any capture proposal leadership team, the way we think about it is advocacy. So there needs to be at least one individual that is advocating essentially for the best product attributes or offering attributes, and that'd be, say, the chief engineer, for example, or the person in charge of engineering for that product or offer. You would certainly want to have an individual that is essentially an advocate for causing the company to think through what can we do for this customer? What can we do for this customer? That's usually the BD person, right?
Yep.
There's usually an advocate for can we actually do it? Is it executable? That's usually like program management.
Okay.
Right. And then certainly the proposal, the key individuals from the proposal leadership team.
Yep. Perfect. I love that. Yeah. I think, an ideal in my company with probably a lot of small businesses, whereas I know SMA probably deals with a lot of larger businesses. And it's just interesting to me how many people don't slow down enough to really think through the strategy of it. And just, I said this earlier, but just kind of go full force ahead with responding to the RFP, but it really is going to be hard to win. My argument always is it's going to be really hard to win if you don't step back and, think through who your executive sponsor is and who's owning this and who is really leading the strategy, and then getting that commitment of the strategy and having those discussions along the way. So this is really great conversation.
Yeah, I think, certainly the early days of SMA, we almost exclusively only supported very large, and back then, aerospace and defense companies, platform companies. Today, we actually have a very broad range of clients from startups to those same companies we're speaking of. And, and oftentimes you find that the teams just aren't that big, so people have to wear multiple hats.
Yeah.
So
the first thing that goes out the window is strategy, right?
Yeah, right. Well, unless there's a strong commitment, organizational commitment towards thinking it through, and you have to be a much more skilled facilitator as an outsider coming in to kind of make sure those advocacies are well represented. We have this thing which we call dynamic tension, which is good for a proposal development process, where program managers should rarely agree with the head of engineering, and they should rarely agree with the BD person, because it's really about because their advocacies are actually almost at the opposite ends of the spectrum.
That's true. That's so true.
Yeah, so it's more difficult to get that dynamic tension to be productive if you're, working with a small team, but it's certainly doable. It can certainly be challenging as well.
Yeah, right. Well, that's some great information. Thank you. I'm going to shift gears here now and talk about competition, because of course it's really not switching gears, because competition is such a big part of strategy. And as we talked about black hats and all of that, but when it comes to competition, where do you think most companies go wrong really thinking about competitive thinking when it comes to proposals and RFP response?
Okay. So I'm going to start with a couple of big ideas, and I'm going to try to reduce it to something practical with some context. Is that okay?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So I think that this might be a bit provocative. So first of all, I think this is one of the more interesting areas in terms of how we should think about ourselves going forward in the future. So I think we still very largely rely on what I call 20th century sources of competitive advantage. And what are those? Historically, they've been either, you can kind of reduce them to one of two categories, either extractive or protective. So what do I mean by extractive? I'll try not to be too abstract.
Okay.
It's about efficiency economics. It's where it's like we devise really clever ways to extract more profits from the customers and suppliers better than our rivals do. I think if you kind of think about, some of your past, for our listeners, their past experiences and proposals, there have certainly been opportunities where our core strategy was extractive. It's really about, how do we necessarily kind of get more of our suppliers, for example, right, to make a better offering for our customer. The protective is perhaps more common from a historical perspective, which is where we create barriers to substitutive economics, is really carrying barriers from your competitors. And by locking in, we do all sorts of things to try to lock in our customers, our suppliers, better than our rivals can. For example, even to this day, after 30 years of clear understanding and knowledge and aspirations around open systems, many of the larger systems that our government buys, whether it's a defense system or other IT systems, they're closed systems. They're not open systems. And why is that? It's because we're trying to lock in the customer into our product, right, forever.
Yeah.
Some examples, for example, for the extractive school of thought back, is, let's see, Dell is a great example, and Cisco, where they're really about, ultimately being successful in the marketplace in terms of how to actually extract higher levels of profit, either from the suppliers or from their customers. And I don't mean that at all to be pejorative. I mean, what Michael Dell did was just phenomenal to the IT industry, as well as Cisco, the founders of Cisco Chambers. On the protective side, two easy examples from the software IT side, Oracle and Microsoft. Almost every aspect of what they do is really around trying to lock in, their solution. So what do we do about that? So that's kind of at a big idea level. I think 21st century sources of advantage need to look more towards companies like Amazon, Netflix, and Google, for example. The two categories I think that we need to make a transition to, and I know these are big ideas, I'll try to reduce it down to something that we can all kind of practice. One is allocative sources of advantage, where we're trying to match competencies to the most important customer needs as better than anybody else. Amazon and Google, I think, are two good examples of that. If you shop on Amazon, and who doesn't these days, right?
Yep.
That's really what they're trying to do. I mean, it's all behind the scenes, but their artificial intelligence in the background, whether it's in the search engine or however else they do it, really, is around trying to match what they have to offer to what your needs are, better and better and better, right? You use those systems more, it actually does a better job at matching what you're looking for to what you're seeing.
Kind of in a scary way.
Yeah, it is. It is. I love Amazon, I have to admit, because it is, for me, the easiest shopping experience.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, as we're in this interview, I'm like ordering the strategy safari on Amazon. I mean, it's that easy that I can be facilitating this discussion and ordering the book. So I'm right there with you.
There's proof right there, right?
Yep, exactly.
So the creative sources is a bit more abstract, but it's really about creating market maker economics better than your rivals. Netflix is a good example of that, or Apple. And it's really about creating new sources of value for your customers where they didn't see it before. Yeah. And Apple is really kind of around the ecosystem, even though that's a closed system is really around there's huge benefits of being within like Apple's ecosystem, right? In terms of having everything work together. Netflix is really kind of around there. They were like the first company to really kind of think through about, well, let's say you watch these 3 things, you might be interested in these 10 things, right?
Yep. Yeah, telling me what I want before I even know that's what I want. I mean, Amazon does that pretty brilliantly for me anyway. Mm-hmm. But, and that is harder to do in the context of a proposal, but that's what would help somebody stand out. Indeed, instead of trying to maybe bash their competition or go with the traditional differentiators, what are the things that you're going to add value to, and how are you going to show them what they need before they even know they need it?
Yeah, and I think on the allocative source of what I call 21st century sources, I think it's really about having this incredible commitment and passion towards serving your customers' needs. I think around the creative source is really kind of having the courage to be innovative, sometimes ahead of your customer.
Yeah.
These are both really hard things to do, right?
Yeah, they sound simple in theory, but the applicability. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, that's really good stuff, though. I love that. And so the other conversation now we're kind of going to move into, and you touched on it a little bit here with the competition, is just the industry in general. I really was fascinated by what you had to say because you've been in the proposal industry longer than I have, and it was interesting to hear your take on how the industry has evolved since you've been in the industry. And I want you to share that with our listeners as well. You have been listening to the RFP Success Show and my interview with Ajay Patel. This is episode 1 of 2. So this is a series, and we will continue this episode next week so you can continue to hear about industry trends and professionalism as I continue my conversation with Ajay Patel of SMA. Thank you again for listening. You've been listening to the RFP Success Show.
You have been listening to the RFP Success Show with RFP expert Lisa Reherik, author of the RFP Success book. If you haven't subscribed to the podcast yet, make sure you click the subscribe button so you don't miss a show. And thanks for spending time with us today.